Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jose David Saldivar, and I'm a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and also the director of CCSRE. So it's my real pleasure to welcome all of you to our first of three Faculty Research Fellows, conversations, chats, discussions of the fellows' works, their latest publications. And we're hoping to keep this really informal. And so that's why there's wine, so hopefully we'll have wine and food. And we see the Faculty Research Fellows presentations and our subsequent discussion and engagement with their work as a way of helping us build a scholarly community. So that's always, I think, a good thing to do at a place like Stanford, is to continue growing and helping us think through issues of transdisciplinary perspectives on race, culture, and ethnicity here at Stanford and at CCSRE. I'm also delighted to welcome our first cohort of Faculty Research Fellows. In the past, we've had external faculty fellows at CCSRE, and there was always a sense of, well, what are we doing for our own faculty? Can't we have some forum, some mechanism that would be a little bit distinct from the faculty seminar series that we do, that would be more informal and that would help support our own faculty? So we decided to do these Faculty Research Fellows. So the first cohort of faculty fellows includes Professor Thomas Blom Hansen from anthropology, John Rickford from linguistics, Sami Aleem from Graduate School of Education, Michelle Landis-Dauber from the law school, Anna Raquel Munian from the history department and also CCSRE, one of our newest FDI faculty, and Sherry Moraga from theater and performance studies. So I think a really interesting cohort that we selected for our first group of fellows. And we're trying to create a combination of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary talks about race and ethnicity. Briefly, we want to use this time and space to help us think about our academic cultures of conversation. Maybe what Paul Gilroy, if I can translate him, would call a culture of convivencia, of conviviality, of, which Tom talks about in his work and talks in his book about South Africa. Processes that are ordinary, culture is ordinary, race is ordinary, in this view that Gilroy suggests. How do we create processes of cohabitation? So I think that's what we envision this series of attempting to do. Now, both Dr. Prudence Carter, the director of RICSRE program, and Dr. Mariam Hamadini, who helped me put together, and the faculty put this together, have worked really hard to help organize these conversations for this quarter and next. But unfortunately, Mariam had a family emergency and so is not with us today. And Prudence Carter, I think, is, as we speak, in an Atlanta studio at CNN doing a town hall meeting that we'll be able to see. But they both send their regrets and their best wishes for us to have a very successful first session. I'd now like to turn our conversation over to my great colleague, Professor Arnitha Ball, a professor in the Graduate School of Education and the director in the program in African American Studies. Professor Ball has graciously agreed to moderate our first session and to give her great wisdom and counsel in helping us continue this conversation. Dr. Ball is the president of the American Educational Research Association, as well as the author of numerous books such as Literacies Unlashed and Multicultural Strategies for Education and Social Change, Careers of the Torch in the US and South Africa. So, without any further ado, Arnitha, why don't you kind of help us continue the conversation, and Arnitha will introduce more formally our speakers today.
Thank you very much, Jose. It is my pleasure to welcome you as well, and it's an honor to serve as the moderator for our group today. As David mentioned, Chautauqua, we have embarked upon a new venture here today. Let me say a few words of definition of Chautauqua. It was an adult education movement in the United States, highly popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. Chautauqua assemblies engaged and spread throughout the rural United States until the mid-1920s. The Chautauqua brought together only the best entertainment and culture with entertainers, preachers, specialists of the day. And we're moving ahead in that same tradition. Somehow, I, in my heart of hearts, believe that Chautauqua historically comes from a Native American Indian cultural beginnings. I'm going to have to do a little bit more investigation on that, and perhaps we can have more conversation about that as well. But in that tradition, we have come together today to engage in comfortable and cross-disciplinary conversations around the publications of these two eminent scholars and fellows of the center. The center is embarking on a interdisciplinary, provocative pairing of two books that, if you look at the title at the surface level, you might wonder, what might these two books have to do with each other? But as we listen deeply to the conversations of the authors, and as you have all had an opportunity to read the work of these two scholars, we will find that there are some intellectual links, some intellectual play between the two books that you have received. And we're going to pay attention to that and think about that, and perhaps you might also want to take a few notes when we get into our informal conversations. I'll begin with a very simple introduction of our speakers. I could speak here for quite some time, but I'm sure you're familiar with some of the accomplishments of these renowned professors. I'll just begin by saying Thomas Blom Hansen is the Reliance Dhirubhai,
yeah.
Abani, professor in South Asian Studies, professor of anthropology, and director of Stanford Center in Asian Studies. He has a broad interest in spanning South Africa and South Asia, several cities, and multiple theoretical and disciplinary interests from political theory and continental philosophy to psychoanalysis, comparative religion, and contemporary urbanism. We'll have an opportunity to listen to his presentation. He has numerous publications, and we'll be looking very closely at one today. Dr. Rickford, John R. Rickford, is a J.E. Wallace Sterling Professor of Linguistics and Humanities here at Stanford University, a former chair of the Stanford Faculty Senate. He's also a courtesy professor in linguistics and also education. His primary specialization is sociolinguistics, including specializations in language variation, ethnicity, social class, style, language. It goes on and on and on. So, at this point, I would like to remind you that we are here to engage in comfortable conversations. We've structured today to begin with approximately 25-minute presentations by each of the authors. Conversation, some things they'd like to bring to your attention, and after their presentations, we will engage in comfortable, conversational, interdisciplinary, intellectual conversations. Our first presentation will be by Dr. John Rickford.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Did I do that wrong?
No, go ahead.
No.
It's totally fine.
The first speaker, no. I told you it was going to be informal. We might even make a mistake or two. So informal. Our first speaker is Thomas.
Okay.
All right, go for it. Yeah, that's right. It was one arm.
Okay. So, would you like me up there?
Make
or-
yourself comfortable,
Okay.
whatever you.
So maybe in the spirit of the event, I'll sit here.
Please do.
If that's okay. Can you hear me? All right. So let me just begin by thanking the center and Jose David and Anita and other people who've been involved in this for this opportunity. I think it's a great initiative. I think we often talk about the need for more interdisciplinarity at Stanford, the silo culture and all that. And here's actually a real attempt to do something about it. And I'm also very actually very happy with being paired with John Rickford's work here. And as I was looking at this very impressive labor of love that's been going on for a long time, I can gather from John's work, I also realized that there was actually a whole lot of different issues that are being debated, especially in your introduction, that I, in a sort of more perhaps oblique way, also address in my work, especially in in chapter 2 of the book that I published recently. So what I'll do is I'll talk about some of these issues that deal with how language is being used and different kinds of varieties of language, and a larger theme of embarrassment that runs through some of my work, and a larger theme of the comical, and how language and the play of language can be used in various ways to both identify with, to denigrate, and to use as the raw material for jokes. And what is the function of the joke, what's the function of the comical, and so on. So I'd like to say something about that, because I think that actually builds in some ways a bridge to John Rickford's work. So let me just begin by saying, I don't assume that all of you have read the whole thing, or even maybe just started to. I have to say, I'm a little ashamed of the length of this book. I thought it wouldn't really stop, I suppose. But anyway, it's work that I've done over a decade, and one does accumulate a whole lot of material. So let me say that this book actually began in 1977 when I was a very young student, and I was engaged in anti-apartheid activities back in my native Denmark. And I think that what happened in 1976 in Soweto, the youth revolt against apartheid education, was a defining moment for me, as it was for, I think, a lot of other people. My older brothers had been active in the Vietnam movement, but for me, that was the moment. So less than 2 years later, I found myself in South Africa, traveling around with a couple of other people, documenting foreign investments in the country, ending up being trailed by the police and being put in the can for a little bit, roughed up, but only gently because I was protected by my skin color, and escorted to Mafeking and sent over the border, and got a stamp in my passport saying that I could never enter the Republic of South Africa again. In fact, I was very proud of it in my own sort of strange way. It's always nice when you're 19 to feel you make a difference, or you do something that's transgressive, and that's certainly what we were looking for. And then I come back to South Africa many, many years later, about 20 years later, to teach at the University of Natal in Durban, and what I find in my class is a whole class full of Indian kids. But Indians of a kind I'd never really met in India. And soon I started to hang out in this particular township, which the book is about, and with them. And then I started doing more serious field work and actually moved out there and lived there for a good period of time. So I say this because in some ways it also frames two different views of what South Africa is and what it was and how it was looked at. When I was there, that was the beginning of a whole new phase of South African history that actually ultimately ended with the defeat of the apartheid regime, or the retreat, one should perhaps say. It was a time where everything was very extremely politicized. It was as if everything was in brackets. There was nothing, language didn't mean what it was supposed to mean. Everything was like in brackets. Which is what happens during times of enormous politicization. It's as if language itself fails somehow because it's always contested. Every meaning is intrinsically and openly contested. So there was a time when I think I, like many other people, were drawn to a particular kind of, let's say, the heroic pathos of that moment, which was a very important moment that continued throughout the 80s. As I returned in late 1990s, South Africa, in the middle of a transition from being an extraordinary country, having enjoyed, or having been, not enjoyed, having been, as it were, at the center of global attention for a very long time, as an exceptional case, as the last remaining bastion of colonialism and so on, in a painful transition to become something else. Something that perhaps also is invoked by the writer Indentured's call for return to the ordinary, call the issues way before the time I'm talking about. So this idea of coming to something else. What I found when I came to this township was something very different from what I found in 1977-78. It was a world that was not concerned necessarily with politics, and certainly not the high politics or the intense everyday politics of anti-apartheid struggle, but another world that was intensely absorbed by itself, absorbed by attempts to maintain what was the older world that had lived in this township that had been set up as one of the early townships in Durban, where people had been forcibly removed from other locations in the city. So it was an apartheid artifice, you could say, but an artifice that had been made into a home by people in all kinds of ways, and people felt very attracted and felt very attached to this place as a place that they had created themselves out of a barren felt or a barren bush. And then, but also a place where people in some ways felt that they were not quite part of the mainstream as people defined as Indians, special racial category, felt that they were not really connected with the larger struggle. People who felt genuinely quite alienated from politics as it was going on both during the apartheid era and after. And people who were, in a sense, busy getting on with their lives, trying to cope with the new changes, but also in many ways constantly engaging in a kind of reflection on what these new times then may mean for me. So the title of the book, for those of you who haven't read the first part, comes directly from this, you can say, dealing with the past that was going on. This attempt to define oneself in a new situation where few parameters were known, and where one's attachment to the township was all of a sudden becoming or put in question. Because this was not a township that had a heroic name to it, like Soweto, or even neighboring Omlasi, a big Zulu-speaking, English-speaking township. This was a township that was unexceptional in every way, inhabited by people where many people, including Zulu speakers and whites, would say, we're not proper South African. So what was it? But it was still a place that people, as I said, felt attached to. And still felt, but at this time felt that they had also somehow lost a way to deal with it, lost a way to, a self-assured way of dealing with that past of their own. So I use melancholia in Freud's sense of a loss that one cannot completely come to terms with or find a language for or speak about. It's a loss that one doesn't really know, one doesn't, as Freud says, one has lost something what one cannot mention or one cannot recognize the object, the lost object. And I think that, so this is what I mean by melancholia of freedom. And a theme in the book which directly connects with this larger theme of language I'll get to now, is that in some ways this attachment to this particular township was about a form of almost illegitimate or slightly embarrassing attachment to, you can say, what I in my book call the banal pleasures of unfreedom. What I mean by that is the fact that this was a place in which people said to me very often that this is a place where I feel that I am myself properly. In the book, I have some various remarks about what this particular kind of racialized governance of South Africa, where race was equated with place. Every place was defined by a racial group, not two, always one. But it meant that the category, the racial category in which you lived, was a shadow that you constantly lived with. Wherever you were always yourself, and you were defined by your racial category. So I talk about the racial doppelganger as a kind of something you couldn't shake off. Only in your own place could that doppelganger, as it were, recede a little bit into the background, and your own, as it were, individual existence could be more fully pronounced. And outside of that space, you would be Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, but you would be overwhelmingly defined by this racial category. This is true, I argue, for everybody. Of course, less so for people on top, that is white people, but also for white people in a perverse kind of way. Let me then get to the question of language. One of the first things that happened to me in my work in this township was some of my students took me to a piece of community theater, which was a genre that had been proliferating, or in various subgenres that proliferated across the township for several decades. It's been very important to the medium for both social critique, for good old family entertainment, for kinds of more risque experimentations as well. I went to this place and it was full of people, and I understood only, as you know, humor is the last thing you ever get to understand about a place that's alien to you, the final points. And I understood very little about what it was funny. Some of it was obviously funny, but I wasn't quite sure why it was funny, or the deeper layers. So I got into it, and one of the things that struck me from the beginning was that virtually every joke and every posture, every role, every character that was played in these different community theaters, including also a very rich, more and more as I was there, actually beginning a sort of stand-up comedy scene that's been proliferating across South Africa in the past 10, 15 years. I think basically this is one of my submissions, is that because the joke is the medium through which you can actually talk about the other. It's very difficult in ordinary, even sort of proper official language to talk about the other outside these rather stable fixed categories, but in the joke you acquire language and a genre through which you can actually address difference in all kinds of ways. Not nice ways always, also very warped and uninteresting ways. And this is the point, that there is no humor, that there's no joke that's also not in some ways nasty. Right? And this is the double edge of humor. What I think is the social importance of humor is that it's both funny and nasty at the same time. So I was intrigued to find out what was the nastiness about. Most of the jokes were about accents. And most of the skits were about accents. The way in which you speak English. So this is a community where people have come together, were historically people from across the Indian subcontinent in from the 1850s onwards, and had come to South Africa, had over decades been living together, first segmented in language communities, and then later on gradually produced as a single ethnicity, a single racial group. But the vernaculars had receded into, they had sort of died out or been less important, and instead South African Indian English had arisen. There is actually an eminent social linguist whose work I see, Rajan Mistry, whose work I also see that you mentioned in your work, who has written very insightfully about this, about the formation of this particular genre of English, or I don't know what you call it. No, I'm not sure about the technical terms. But anyway, so this is the de facto vernacular in which these theater traditions, these joking cultures were being performed. And so everything was about how do you then master this particular language. This language is already a hodgepodge of many different borrowings from Tamil, from Hindi, from Afrikaans, a whole lot from Afrikaans. In fact, this is true for all, let's say, popular vernaculars across South Africa. Whether you want it or not, that's actually Afrikaans, sort of low Afrikaans has been one of the real lingua francas. And a lot of the jokes were about how you master this or didn't master. And the mastery of this particular language, or even the accent in which you did it, also indicated your place largely in a sort of temporal scale. So I use in my book, I play with two categories, which is local categories, the Chalu and the Lani. The Chalu being the term for the proverbial South African Indian working class man. It's a term that has an uncertain provenance. Some people say it comes from Afrikaans, means burned man or charred man. Other people say it comes from chala, which also means little shots or little, actually, intoxicants, which is a Hindi term. Other people say it comes from achar, which is like minor. This is the condiments you eat with Indian food, and so on. So all of them, whatever etymology you want to establish, is all about something that's little, right? That's minor. And then you have the Lani, again a very interesting term, that is boss. And those are so the white people can be Lanis, but mostly Lani is used for the middle class Indian. And how is the middle class Indian known? By his accent or her accent, right? The clipped white South African accent that is mastered and used to that effect to also, as it were, perform class, perform hierarchy. So a lot of these, the humor was played, and I mentioned various examples in my work where the sort of contradistinction where you have someone who on stage will come up dressed as a working class, he looks like a child but speaks like a Lani, and the other way around, a man in tie and suit coming expecting him to speak like a Lani, what comes out of his mouth is the broad child variety of South African Indian English. So this is in some ways a fundamental tool or fundamental axis around which a lot of humor revolves. Of course, this is a humor that fundamentally deals with the past. Right? So some of the most popular characters in these genres have to do with people who speak our language, or perform, as it were, our own, as people would say, how stupid we are. Right? Our performs a certain immaturity of the community. And by laughing at this figure, this child figure, you also laugh at the past. You also assert your own superiority in relationship to that past, signifying that you have indeed moved so much beyond that you can laugh at yourself, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the dynamics going on. It's a world that is entirely closed to people from the outside. I was always the only non-Indian in the audience. And it was very interesting that the way that I was received at these community plays, people would come up to me and say, "But sir, do you really want a ticket for this play? Don't you understand that this is very, how should I say, Indian?" And I say, "Well, that's exactly because I would like to see something Indian." "Yes, that's fine, but you know, do you understand this is not what you would, as a white person, understand as properly Indian?" No, that's the whole point. So they kept on sort of using arguments for why I shouldn't hear these things. Because why? Because it was a kind of, I use the term cultural intimacy, which is coined by the anthropologist Michael Rickford, for a certain kind of enjoyment and also embarrassment. And in fact, the embarrassment is part of the enjoyment of this kind of internal world that you cannot be privy to and shouldn't be. So there was a kind of, so that's really when I felt like an anthropologist. I shouldn't really be here, but this is a moment of, but also a moment of great, you can say, warmth once people found out. And there was the other funny kind of thing that happened to me that people quickly found out. I became a minor celebrity because it turned out that I knew much more about India than anyone else in the entire country. And I was constantly interviewed about this and asked about it. And I remember one particularly hilarious moment was when I was sitting with a a bunch of guys, and they would say in a half-drunken state, would say to me, "So, tell me, why you know about these things, we Indians, why do we do this caste thing? Why do we do it? Tell us, why do we do it?" So I became a kind of unwilling interlocutor, unwilling interpreter of what people thought was also the proper culture out of which they came, knowing fully well that in fact they were improper, in fact kind of imposters in this sort of realm of improper Indians to which they could never fully aspire. So in some ways, and I'll end by that to say that the play of language, the play of this sort of, as it were, non-legitimate, this low form of English that was used all the time, this sort of play with the hierarchy of the genre was put to work all the time, was used both to, in a sense, affirm community. I use the term ethnic closure in two ways, as a kind of both a closure as in a sort of therapeutic sense of saying, yes, this is how we are, and this is, well, this is how we are. We have to come to terms with that. On the other hand, there's also a closure that shuts out people. So it's a way of coming to terms with yourself that cannot involve other people. So it's a very complex mechanism. And also I think that this the question that constantly came up to me and came up in the discussions was also that could there be a way of, in a sense, recognizing this low culture, this child culture, for what it actually was, without constantly setting it in relationship to other forms, a linguistic hierarchy within English, or setting it in, and within English, of course, also in a racial hierarchy, because the masters of real English would always be white, because even the most perfectly speaking Lani would, of course, always be seen in this hierarchy of things as somewhat not quite authentic. Or always someone who has tried a little bit too hard. That's the comical part of the Lani, right? He tries too hard. Whereas, could there be a way of acknowledging that this is indeed a mixed culture, this is a hybrid culture, that doesn't even try to aspire to be properly Indian, because that's the other thing. A lot of middle-class people would then try to purify their practices, become proper Hindus, proper Muslims, some converted to Christianity, to opt out of the Hindu universe altogether, or even out of the Salvation universe altogether, and so on. And much of that went along with also a change of accent. So I was looking at this and thinking, is there a way that people could even begin to acknowledge the existence of this culture as something in and of itself, something that actually is a proper, as it were, cultural form. And in a strange way, people do, by embracing these community plays, by embracing these forms of entertainment, through the joke, through the medium of the joke, through the insider story or whatever. But they don't acknowledge it as something that, it doesn't have a public face, it doesn't have a public language, it doesn't have a public name. Some people ask me, but these people are, and I remember I was at a meeting, and I'll start with this, where President Mbeki was then campaigning in 1999 before his first term. And he came, and there was a big group of leaders assembled in a room, 500 people, and he said, why can't you just, why call yourself Indians? Why can't you call yourself African Indians? And people would then go through the motions and say, well, you know, but some people went up and said, but the problem is that nobody wants to acknowledge that we are African Indians. Because nobody wants to buy it. We're just talking about who wants to own the hyphen. Nobody wants the hyphen. The Africans don't want the hyphen. Today, Zulu nationalism is running, has actually become kind of a common sense, you could say, in the city of Durban in a way that it wasn't before. So it's very, yes, this is my time, right? Yeah. So this is, I'll end with this. As a kind of joking genre, as a linguistic genre, it clearly has, in a sense, a vernacular of its own. How can it, should it, also develop, as it were, find a name for itself, let's say, a substantialization of its own cultural form rather than keeping it constantly in abeyance or in some tension with the major forms of either major Indian, major English. Thank you.
Thank you. John. Dr.
My turn again?
It's your turn.
You get two.
I was about to give you another turn. So I do have, I do have a PowerPoint, so I am going to stand here for a while, and then I'll go and sit down. And we also have a little handout on your table. Come on, wake up. Yes, I think there's one here. There's one here under the book. Yeah. Not that you'll necessarily need it immediately, but
Thank you.
yeah. So I had to come up with a title that embraced all these different things that I wanted to talk about. And so I came up with the one that you have here. And I wanted to say, first of all, that there are some parallels with Tom Hansen's Melancholia. He found some in language. I found some particularly at the level of history. So most of the Indians in South Africa, if you've been doing the reading, you know that a small percentage, about 15%, are passenger Indians who came kind of voluntarily, and presumably later on. They're about the same time, okay.
But paying their own way.
Right, they paid their own way. Whereas almost all of the Indians in Guyana, at least historically, until very recently, came as indentured servants. So most Indians in South Africa came, as I say here, between 1869 and 1890 as indentured laborers. They were from lower caste, from Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in the south. But then also a group seems to be from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So I'm going to try not to use my laser, Tom, because I don't want to end your career today. So it could do that too, but we'll talk about it later. So most Indians in Guyana, in fact, about 200,000 of them came between 1838 and 1917. And in fact, as you look at these different places, you know, you get a sense of the power of the British Empire and how they could kind of move people around like pawns in a chess game. In the case of Guyana, most of the people, you know, came from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, so they're Bhojpuri speakers, a kind of variant of Hindi. And we didn't really have many from the south, although there is a whole concept of a Madras Indian, which is a different kind of thing. And if we were kind of to look at this more politically and historically, a lot of what happened is that African slavery, of course, had been in force in Guyana for many more years, since the 17th century, and you had emancipation followed by apprenticeship, when the owners said, well, the slaves aren't quite ready for freedom, so for 4 years we're going to allow them to be apprentices so they could really learn to be on their own. And then they really had no labor force, and then they had to find other people. So they tried everybody. They tried Chinese, they tried Portuguese, and then they started bringing these masses of Indians. And at first there was some kind of class tension between Indians and Africans, because many recently liberated Africans were playing hardball with the sugar estates for their labor. And in a sense, the arrival of, you know, droves of Indians helped to break that kind of political movement. But over time, that kind of worked itself out. So I actually found some cartoons from the late 19th century from the Argosy newspaper. This kind of gives you a view of some of these early arrivals. So here is this white woman. I like the way the cartoonist has them positioned. He's not just a great artist, but in terms of depicting the figures, but the positions, you know, her sideways and him facing forward is a beggar. And this one is called Every Man Has His Price. And so the white woman says, don't you understand me? I mean, are you a Christian and do you go to chapel? So there's a lot of concern about, you know, Hindus and so on, you know, and Muslims converting. And the beggar says, no, misi, me no go sapel. But suppose you give him to me 1 bit, misa go sapel. So she gives him a penny, and he says, but if you give me 8 cents, then I'll go to chapel, which I thought was just wonderful. So here you can see he has on in Guyana, at least you call this a dhoti. I'm not sure the name for the turban. And you can see the difference in the language quite dramatically. Of course, she speaks very standard English, and he speaks this deep Creole. There's actually some elements of this that are almost pidgin-like, which I talk about in my 1986 book, but I'm not going to go into those here. But note in particular the subject me, so me go chapel, not I go chapel, and so on. And then here's a different one that shows something about the relations between the races at the time, the local kind of working races. So here's an Afro-Guyanese woman who by this stage is more acculturated to English customs, but she may well be a middle class or lower middle class person. They've been in the country a lot longer. And because the slave trade had ended since 1806. And so here's the Indian woman. She's still wearing, a sari. She's obviously dressed in Indian dress. And the woman who's described as a coolie lady, and this is a term that comes up a few times. It's a very common term for Indians in laborers in the New World. And the Indian woman says, "You not tell me morning, me not tell you morning." Now, you didn't say good morning to me, I'm not saying good morning to you. And the black woman says, "Them coolies is getting too upstarted. They're getting too full of themselves. Before time it was morning, missy." So even the black woman would expect her to say good morning and call her missy. Now they want decent people, like me, to tell them morning. That is the worst of civilization and rubbish like them. Okay, so very strong opinions here. All turning on this notion of who's more acculturated, who is more acquired. This, by the way, happened not just with Indian indentured servants, but there was one woman who's written a powerful dissertation that I was external examiner on in Trinidad, who looked at the Yoruba, because they also brought some indentured Africans in the 19th century, a second wave of people, often people who they rescued off ships of other countries, like the Spanish, who were continuing slavery late in the 19th century. They would say, well, look, we could repatriate you back to Liberia and so on, but you could come to Guyana, we'll give you a salary for 5 years, the same deal we're giving the Indians. And so they would come and they would speak Yoruba and they would do their things. And very often the local blacks would also look on them as kind of primitives, this funny language and so on. So in fact, she discusses the kind of decline of Yoruba among descendants in Guyana, in a sense assassinated from within, because the families, the children who became more acculturated, would tell them when they started to do the Yoruba chants and so on, go out in the yard and do that nonsense. We don't want to hear that. We want our children to have a chance in the new vision. So anyhow, there are a lot of interesting race and ethnicity stories we could talk about here. One of the stories, of course, has to do with what happened politically in the 20th century. Forbes Burnham and Chetty Jagan, both one of Indian, one of African descent, formed this People's Progressive Party in the 1950s to fight British colonial rule, but they split and eventually competed, had two separate parties. And in the early 1960s, there were tremendous race riots. Well, of course, historically, we've learned too that the CIA would play its own role in helping to facilitate some of these divisions. And there's another part to that story which I can tell you. I can tell you later on. Charles Chetty Jagan, a certain generation would probably know about him, but Chetty Jagan was married to an American Jewish woman, Janet Jagan, whom everybody in Guyana said was the one that made him such a bad man, taught him about communism and so on. And she eventually became prime minister. But there are some jokes that developed during, in particular, Burnham's presidency, but I'll try not to get too far afield. I wanted to say a bit, switching a little bit to linguistics, I wanted to say a bit more about my article in this book, Language, Culture, and Identity. I don't think you got the whole book, because I just asked you to look at one article. And of course, like Thomas, I'm going to assume you've read these things carefully, and I'm going to ask you a question about page 134, the second paragraph, and I'll expect you to tell me what's there. So this is a book that I did, I edited with Jeanette Alsop, who was the wife of deceased Richard Alsop, who's the guy on the right. He was actually my high school principal for a while. And one of the first people to work do linguistics and work on Guyana. And in fact, I used a lot of his master's thesis. It had studied some of the same variables I'd studied. And in fact, it was really quite remarkable that our quantitative analyses matched so closely. But that's a separate story to be told. The article I asked you to look at, the social and the linguistic, in sociolinguistic variation, in this book, was meant to kind of counter a very widespread, almost over-enthusiasm about social meaning and identity in language. So very often, variation in language use is a powerful reflection of social group differences, as I say here, marking ethnicity, age, class, gender, and so on, and people's identities and ideologies. And my favorite quote in return to ideology is this one from Count Ozzy, who was a Jamaican musician, about the Rastafarian language and reggae music. He said, we were fighting colonialism and oppression, not with gun and bayonet, but wordically, culturally. Okay, so to some extent, doing some of your wordic, politics or self-identity. So linguist Robert Lepage and Andre Tabrier-Keller wrote a very famous 2005 book called Acts of Identity, which says that, in general, people choose the language they want to use to reflect the groups that they want to identify with. And they have some writers and qualifications to the theory, but in practice, most people, including Lepage and Tabrier-Keller, ignore it. So one of the things that they tend to ignore is social constraints. Linguistic constraints. So that almost everything that people do linguistically is an act of identity, So I chose this particular feature to look at, the use of me as subject pronoun, as in the sentence we had, me no go sapel, or me no tell you morning, okay? Where instead of using I, you use me, okay? Which doesn't make a distinction in case. Okay, let me try not to talk too much linguistics, but it doesn't distinguish between subject, object, and possessive. Me is the subject, me is the object, and me is the possessive, which, by the way, is one of the features that helps people to learn the varieties at the stage when they're adapting from their native Indian varieties or African varieties to English. It's kind of pigeon-like. So if you look in modern days at the way these things are distributed, you'll see that, for instance, it's clearly a rural marker. Walter Edwards, who wrote this 1983 article kind of extolling the Lepage and Tabrier-Keller approach, said, rural Guyanese use it about 44% of the time instead of I, but urban Guyanese use it less than 1%, 0.004. And then in my own study in Cane Walk, which is an Indian village just outside Georgetown, I showed that the working class, estate class, used it about 8 or 9% of the time, and the lower middle class used it only about 11% of the time. This is over maybe 5,000 occurrences, Now, Alsop in 1958, when he did his study, showed that about 1% of the time, a little higher than Edwards, the people in Georgetown use me as a subject. And I said, but if you look at those cases, I went through every one of his cases. If you look at those cases, you'll see it's not only that it occurs rarely, but it's always before the negator, ain't. Well, they say, me I know. So me I know, meaning I don't know. Okay? So it's not just that phrase, so it could be other things like me and see the man, I didn't see the man. Okay? Now, we don't fully understand why it happens so much before the negator. Part of the theory may be that the me and no is a kind of fixed idiom, and people start to say that. They don't say me na no or me no no like the Indian people we saw in the cartoons, but they say me and no. So these speakers are very unlikely to use me as subject in positive sentences. So they're very unlikely to say me see the man. They're much more likely to use or I. So we shouldn't overcredit them for the use of the Creole. So in a sense, the language use is whatever kinds of social categories or social ideologies people may have, is always constrained to some extent by linguistic factors that in fact most people are unaware of. And in fact, some of the ways in which you can tell the difference between a true insider, maybe like some of the people in the townships that Thomas is talking about, and an outsider, is they don't get those insider rules because they didn't grow up with the linguistic conditioning. Now, Edwards, actually, I was referee, I can say it now, I was referee for his article that was published in Language and Society back in 1983. And this, in fact, was one of our arguments. And eventually, I didn't make a fuss about it, and it got published. Because he said, you know, we have other forms. For instance, we use a habitual marker to say something happens often. You might just say, I run every day. Whereas Guyanese would say, either I does run every day, and unstressed does, or lower down in the Creole, they would say, me I run every day, okay? And so he looked at the variation between and does and zero, whether you say something like you run versus you does run, and he says, this is active identity, and he gives it all kinds of stuff. Well, one of the things that Bickerton and another linguist had noticed before that is that when you have a when clause or an if clause, you don't get these markers. So when I was commenting on the article, I said, hey, you know, he gave some examples with when I said, you've got to take these examples out because the distinction is neutralized in this environment. And he said, no, it's all identity and so on. I looked through all the cases in my data, and every time you had when or if, you never got are or does. So in other words, here's another case where the language was constraining it. I made an analogy. If you see somebody who's not standing for the national anthem, and it turns out, you know, they have no legs or they're paralyzed or so on, you can't say, well, that's an act of defiance. Right? So we need to stop attaching. I mean, the CSRE crowd is the kind of crowd I think would love this social identity and social meaning. But the whole point of that paper is you have to be also looking at the way language constrains it, or else you'll get it. So there's some other points about it, but I'm gonna try and move on since I have 10 minutes left. So I want to say a bit about the book the bigger book which I wrote with Julie Sweetland, one of our former graduates, my wife Angela Rickford, who's here to make sure I don't misrepresent us, and then Thomas Grano, who in fact was a syntactician, people we just interviewed as a job candidate actually now. This is very different from the work that he does in syntax. A couple things about it. So English is by far the most widely used language in the world, okay? Spoken as a first language by majority populations in many countries around the world. A lot of this is due to the extensiveness of the British Empire in the 19th and 20th century. So in that period, the British Empire, as we say here, had a population of about 400 to 500 million, which was around a quarter of the world's population at the time. Okay? So a lot of people say, you know, the world was painted red, because in many maps, red was used to represent Britain. So you can see here what that world looked like. And that's excluding North America, who by this stage had kind of wiggled out of being a colony a couple hundred years before. But, you know, at the height, it included vast stretch of countries in Africa, Americas, Atlantic, Antarctica, Asia, and so on and so forth. Now, we could say a lot more about this and what happened to English. In many ways, I like to think of English as like Nina Simone has a song, I'm not an oak, I'm a willow, and I can bend. And English, to some extent, was like that. It's like a willow. So it took in other people's languages and cultures. And unlike some other colonial powers that kind of tried to withhold the language, in fact, Britain in its empire kind of insisted on spreading their language and having people adopt their language. They could modify it, but they had to adopt it. Okay. What we're looking at when we look at these varieties around the world is we're looking at particularly the vernacular varieties, the kind of everyday spoken languages as contrasted with the standard of official language. And in many of the cases that we're talking about, there are non-standard spoken varieties used by descendants of slaves, ethnic minorities, immigrants, subjugated populations. And the varieties usually have very low social prestige and are not used in education. But the very fact that they're ignored or disparaged in education is one reason that schools often fail to help speakers of these varieties reach their full potential. Okay? And obviously we're not looking at non-English varieties. They're interesting French Creoles, and there's interesting work in bilingual education, but these aren't covered by our book. Now, a personal comment. So this book grew out of a bibliography that my wife and I began to compile around 1994 when she was doing her dissertation at the School of Ed here. And so in a sense, we could say the book took 20 years, because we weren't thinking about doing a book at the time. We were just trying to kind of keep track of all these different references. But I think it was also unlikely that I would have done it early in my career, but because of the type of book it was. It's a bibliography, albeit, you know, topic focused and topic coded and partly annotated. I wouldn't have expected to win the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer Prize for my bibliography. And also because of the focus on application rather than theory, even though there are theories about applications. So my own little comment here is I hope CCSRE, and I hope more people from CCSRE were here, is mature and wise enough by now, as I think I am. That is, I'm at a stage where, you know, I'm not trying to get tenure for my book. It started about the same time we started, to embrace application as well as theory. Because, as I say at the bottom here, the need for applications of our expertise is critical among many of the ethnic groups that we study. Even though in many ways I say, you know, 3 chairs for every vernacular variety and Creole that exists around the world, because that's my work. You know, it's something for me to do. The people sometimes, because of those very varieties, face tremendous challenges in occupations, in the courts, in the schools, and so on. And I think we have an obligation to try and work with them in doing something about it. So I am not going to try to go through all of this. Those of you who have the book know that we deal with references from about 1960s to 2012. We have about 1,625 references. The book itself has these topic overviews. We have 22 different topics, and so we code every reference for what kind of topic it is. Does it deal with reading? Does it deal with writing? Does it deal with policy, ideology? And then we have the bibliography, and about a third of them are abstracted. So we have 2 kinds of codes. We have these numerical language variety codes that tell you what variety or varieties are covered by each item. And then we have the alphabetical topic codes, so that Lisa Delpit's article, What Should Teachers Do? Ebonics and Culturally Responsive Instruction, gets a code of 1 for African American English, and then IRS. By this stage, I can't even remember. Probably identity, something having to do with reading, and then something having to do with strategies for instruction. And we actually didn't have enough space in the book to list all the language variety codes, so we had to put that part of the book on my website. So if you wanted to kind of know all of the articles that deal with Native American English, you'd have to go to the website, and we list all of those there. But the alphabetical topic codes we list in full, one after the other, so that if you're only interested in one particular subset of things, then you can just go and read all the things in that, under that heading. So then this gives you an idea of what all the different categories are. And then we have these introductions for each category. This is one of the hardest parts about the book. You know, we kind of finished it. We had the whole bibliography. And I said, well, we have to have a kind of introduction to each one. So, you know, you're kind of tired. You just want to get the book out the door. And you've got to go back and look at all the things in each category and then write an overview to it, so that the reader who comes fresh to it would have some kind of way of digesting it. Because we know no one is going to actually sit down and begin at A and work their way all the way through to Z. Let me just say a bit about a couple articles. Actually, probably mainly this one, because this one, in fact, was the article that helped to get me into linguistics. It's written by LePage, the same guy I just talked about, who has the acts of identity theory. It's kind of interesting to me because he's like my own mentor, William Leboff, in that he combines both a kind of theoretical, descriptive part and then an applied part. And this article helped me to switch from being a literature major at UC Santa Cruz to a self-designed major in sociolinguistics. And for various reasons, which I've talked about in a separate article, I didn't really return to the applied interests until the Ebonics controversy exploded in 1996-97. But There was a lot of, the political climate of the 1960s, I think, fed a number of these articles. LePage 1968, like Lebov et al. 1968, which was one of the first detailed studies, community studies of African American English. It kind of came out of this drive to increase social equity and political development. In the US, this was the period when the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were passed. In the Caribbean and West Africa, it was a period when you had a lot of countries that gained independence. Barbados, Guyana, Nigeria, Trinidad and Tobago. So, and at every stage then people were saying, well, we have the chance to kind of decide anew what we want our education system to look like and decide on the role of language. And one of the things that people found, both in the US and the Caribbean and parts of West Africa, is that the strongest users of the most vernacular varieties of English also did the most poorly in schools, especially in English and the language arts. So this is just some figures that LePage showed back in 1962. You'll see that the pass rates weren't too great in anything, but in particular he was focusing on the pass rates in English language. But basically only about 1/5 of the students who took these exams, which were at the time written and set in England by London University or Oxford and so on, passed them. Sometimes they did better in other subjects, like Belize, but then if you notice the N is pretty small there for that too. So he said that part of the problem is that neither the teachers nor the children were equipped to recognize the differences between Creole and Standard English. So instead of being able to keep the two systems separate, the children try to make one system out of the vernacular, and the result naturally satisfies nobody. Okay? And in fact, very often, children are inhibited from creative expression when they use the vernacular, and the prizes often go to the best mimics rather than the most talented or creative. Okay, so in a sense, you're losing in both ways. The kids who are really creative but don't speak the standard are not getting ahead, and so people who are getting ahead actually are not very creative. Okay. And he said the educators lack the linguistic training and have barriers against recognizing the Creole. So we should have a specialist post in English language teacher training. You should have a training in linguistics, psychology, sociology, education, and so on. And I was at Santa Cruz, which was a pretty liberal place. You could design your own majors. I noticed Stanford has just, within the last month, completely canceled the independently designed major. So I kind of took his book in one hand, and I took the bulletin in the other hand, and I kind of crafted my own major with sociology and linguistics, created my own sociolinguistics. Okay, so over the years I've moved away from that to some extent, but that's one of the key articles. So there are a lot of other articles there that are of interest. I'm not going to try to walk you through all of them. I have one from Arnita Ball, 1992, Cultural Preferences in Expository Writing of African American Adolescents. Anastasia Zendia, Growing Up Bilingual. I'm not going to go through all those titles, but I try to put some things here that kind of represent the kind of range. So books on Aboriginal English, Gakwin 2006, which deals with Inupiaq kids, village English, and then some other articles that deal with vernaculars in other parts of the world. And I just give some other things here, some other examples, but they're not. It's hard to cover 1625 books and articles in 25 minutes. You give me another 25 minutes, I can do it, but I don't think you necessarily want that. So let me stop here and then sit back down, and then we can take any questions and so on that come up. Thank you.